I am Locutus of Borg.
Jean-Luc Picard is undoubtedly one of science fiction's greatest captains, but his life's not entirely built on magnificent victories. Those of you who have watched closely know that he's a hero with scars, a revered leader whose stature was shaped by loss and guilt. Picard is the gold standard of Starfleet Command, but his life is also a lesson in endurance. As a child, he grew up surrounded by emotional instability, which translated into the restraint and self-discipline he displayed as an adult. And the most defining traumatic moment of his life, when he was transformed into Locutus against his will, well, the weight of that memory had a profound impact on his later leadership. Today, we will not explore Picard simply as a legendary figure with dozens of accomplishments. Let's look at him as a man, a human being who didn't let himself be weighed down by his pain.
It was hours before I found you. If you hadn't dropped that pad.
A cold, broken childhood. Jean-Luc was born in Le Bar, France, to parents Maurice and Yvette in 2305. He had an older brother named Robert, and along with their father, they would tend to their family's vineyards when Jean-Luc was a child. French had become an obscure language by the 24th century, which is why he spoke English with a definitive UK accent. Maurice and Yvette wanted their kids to preserve the virtues their family held dear, so the children were raised with the ideals followed from ancient traditions, and knowledge of technical issues was especially avoided. It's later mentioned in the episode titled Night Terrors that Jean-Luc had a grandfather who turned into a frail man unable to make his way home, but was a powerful and intelligent figure before that. He used to be fascinated by ships as a child, which certainly played an important part in his wanting to join Starfleet. He built many model airships and a replica of the Promelian battlecruiser in his early adolescence. He took a particular fancy to the Phoenix, the first vessel made by humans that was warp-capable. He admired it 100 times at the Smithsonian, but was never able to touch it, as we see in Star Trek First Contact. As a fifth grader, he would read about ancient Bajoran civilizations, but he also wrote an award-winning report on starships when he was in grade school. His father wanted both his sons to work at the vineyard, but it was quite apparent that Jean-Luc was meant for different things. Maurice never really supported his decision to join Starfleet, and Robert remarked how Jean-Luc always wanted bigger and better things, like becoming president of the school, then valedictorian, and later an athletic champion. On certain occasions, Robert even bullied his younger brother out of jealousy because he felt Jean-Luc was better than him at everything. As a boy, he also took piano lessons, but didn't pursue them because he was anxious about playing before a large crowd. As an adult, Picard remarked that he regretted quitting piano because his mother used to like hearing him play. Yvette was a loving mother to him and often played hide-and-seek with her younger son. She would also encourage him to look up at the stars. She would tell him wondrous stories that fueled his imagination. Unfortunately, Jean-Luc was too young to understand that these were symptoms of mental illness and not just passing fancies. Sometime in the early 2310s, the mother and son were playing hide-and-seek in the tunnels underneath their home, and his mother got lost. Maurice found his son later, whose foot had gotten stuck, and then placed his wife in a locked room for the night so she would be safe. She begged her son to let her out, and he did. But the next morning, Picard found his mother dead by suicide. This was naturally jarring for a young boy, and he developed a tendency to remain guarded at all times from that tender age onward. I imagine that on some level, maybe he internally blamed himself for her death because he was the one who had let her out when she had been locked in specifically for her safety. Yvette's death never really left him because even as an adult, he would picture an older version of her inviting him to have tea and a nice long talk. And I think that maybe, if that happened, he would be able to share with her how he no longer just looked up at the stars, but journeyed amongst them too. He could tell her of his own experiences at Starfleet, about how her stories to him had all come true. It was quite unfortunate that Yvette and Maurice did not have a very happy marriage, and initially their youngest son assumed it was because his father was abusive. Later, however, he realized that his mother suffered from serious mental health ailments and had refused to take treatment, even when her husband actively tried to help her. Moving on was certainly difficult after an incident as traumatic as this, so gradually, Picard closed himself off so that he would never be hurt again. Remember how Spock once remarked that Picard almost had Vulcan-like qualities? Well, now you know where they started. First deep wound, the Nausicaan stabbing. Leaving the generational family business to join Starfleet Academy was something that caused quite a stir among Picard's loved ones, but he was adamant in his decision. He was actually not able to pass the test to gain entry during his first try, but did succeed with his second attempt in 2323. He would go on to be one of the most accomplished cadets in his class, but his career there was not very smooth. He later mentioned how Boothby, the groundskeeper at the Academy, helped him tremendously in developing a mature outlook. He even went to the extent of saying that without Boothby, he wouldn't even have graduated. Jean-Luc developed a solid interest in archaeology and was even encouraged by his professor Galen to continue exploring the field further. Despite never becoming an archaeologist in an official capacity, his interest remained the same, and he later became quite a credible figure regarding the subject. He was also great at sports and became the first freshman to win the Starfleet Academy Marathon. He was assigned to train on Morrigan 7 during his sophomore year, which is when he encountered Nausicaans for the first time, since the latter had an outpost on a nearby asteroid. Cadet Picard joined the Speed of Light Club in 2327 on the cruiser USS Leondegrance, which was commanded by Captain Nyota Uhura. After graduating at the top of his class, he became an officer, and by his own admission to Wesley Crusher, was very green and cocky. We see in Star Trek Nemesis how Picard describes his younger self as a damn fool, selfish, ambitious, very much in need of seasoning. His promising career suffered a major setback while he was on shore leave at Farscape Starbase Earhart. We actually see this incident play out in the episode Tapestry, where Picard dies and meets Q in the afterlife, and experiences flashbacks to the time when he was stabbed through his heart. In Samaritan's Snare, he also tells Wesley Crusher how he got an artificial heart in the first place, as he had picked a fight with 3 Nausicaans at a bar and was impaled from the back by a stake. He even laughed after looking at the stake protruding from his chest. Thankfully, Picard survived because medical facilities were readily available, but the injury was too serious for his heart to remain functional, so he was given an artificial one. In the aforementioned episode, where he meets Q and the latter agrees to give Picard a second chance, Jean-Luc goes back to the past during the time of the bar fight and chooses not to engage the Nausicaans. As a result, he does not get stabbed and retains his human heart. However, the future consequence of changing his life's trajectory alarms him when he sees that, in the aftermath, everything about his life has changed. The future Picard serves not as a captain, but as an assistant astrophysics officer aboard the USS Enterprise D, dressed in blue rather than red, and reports directly to Worf. In that timeline, trying to make sense of it all, Picard heads to sickbay, where he finds Q waiting for him. Q explains, almost casually, that this is the life that followed from their agreement, which Picard created when he chose not to fight the Nausicaans. In this version of events, Picard gets exactly what he claimed to have wanted: a safe existence. He runs tests, analyzes data, and submits reports to his superiors. He's undoubtedly competent and reliable, but entirely unremarkable. And most importantly, he is not a man in command. Q reminds him that he was granted his wish, but Picard protests because he can't endure a life stripped of everything that gives it meaning. Q counters by saying that this is the man the latter chose to become, the young officer who refused to stand up to the Nausicaans, who never risked himself or his friends, and grew into someone very different from the man Picard actually remembers being. Being stabbed through the heart almost cost him his life, but it also changed him and forced him to confront just how fragile life really is. From that moment on, the original Jean-Luc chose boldness over caution and decided to take risks and leave his mark on the universe rather than drift along safely and remain unnoticed. Without that defining brush with death, everything was different, as he accomplished nothing of consequence and no one even knew who he was. He became the kind of man who would never, under any circumstances, be entrusted with the command of a starship. Realizing what he had lost, Picard then begs Q to undo the changes. He decides that dying in the present, after having lived a full and meaningful life, is far better than continuing to live as a dull, unremarkable man, stripped of the passion and imagination that defined him. While the stabbing was a hard event to come to terms with, and living with an artificial heart was extremely challenging, what was on the other side was completely bland and unsatisfying. Picard therefore embraced the scars from his fight with the Nausicaans as a stepping stone to fulfilling his true destiny.
Go! Let go! No!
They don't want you to fall!
The Borg Horror, creation of Locutus. His kidnapping by the Borg was probably the most challenging part of his career as a Starfleet captain and his life in general. In 2365, Q flung the Enterprise 7,000 light-years into uncharted space and into the path of a Borg cube. The ship survived the encounter, only barely, becoming the first Federation vessel known to escape and warn Starfleet of the Borg's existence. The next year, in 2366, a single cube destroyed the New Providence colony and the USS Lalo, and when the Enterprise tried to stop it, captured Captain Picard. Following this, against his consent, his mind was invaded and his body altered, and Locutus of Borg was born. He was to be a bridge, a sort of voice to tell humanity that resistance was futile. Through him, Earth would fall quickly, efficiently, and perfectly by Borg standards, with as few casualties on both sides as possible. The Borg Queen herself seemed to take a particular interest in Picard, hinting that Locutus was different, maybe even to the point where he was capable of standing beside her. Through him, the Borg gained access to everything he knew, which included technologies, strategies, and his intimate understanding of Federation defenses. All this knowledge was used by the Collective with devastating consequences at the Battle of Wolf 359, where 39 Starfleet ships were destroyed. It was only possible thanks to Picard, but stripped of his agency, he had no way of preventing the massacre. An away team from the Enterprise rescued him on Earth and implanted false data in the cube, destroying the link to the Collective. Jean-Luc was retrieved at great cost, but while this ensured Earth's safety, the same could not be said for the man in question. His assimilation had altered him genetically, turning him into a receiver who could still hear the Collective when they were near, even after his implants were removed. He returned to duty, but the incident at Wolf 359 kept haunting him. The trauma from being assimilated, the memory of what he had done as Locutus, and the knowledge that the Borg had used his own mind as a weapon against his people virtually kept him up at night. The weight of it stayed with him for decades and nearly overwhelmed him during his visit to the artifact. In 2373, when the Borg attempted a second invasion, that unwanted connection gave him advance warning and helped him detect a weakness in their defenses at the Battle of Sector 001. The Starfleet Command initially feared he would bring an unstable element into the crisis and ordered the Enterprise to stay away. Picard chose to act. He led the ship into battle and thwarted the Borg's attempt to alter history and prevent the Federation's formation. The same man the higher-ups feared was compromised ended up becoming their greatest weapon. Normally, this would have been at least a little vindicating for Picard, but his scars ran too deep. The full extent of what had been done to him surfaced as late as 2401. What had long been diagnosed as Irumodic syndrome was revealed to be the result of the Borg's genetic alterations. These were even passed to his son, Jack Crusher, who became a transmitter rather than a receiver, and I'm going to talk about this in just a while. By embedding Picard's Borg-altered DNA into Starfleet's transporter systems, the changelings enabled the Borg Collective to compromise Starfleet from within and begin another attempt to seize the Federation. The trauma of Wolf 359 was also not solely felt by Picard himself. Benjamin Sisko, first officer of the USS Saratoga, lost his wife in the battle and initially blamed Picard when they met in 2369 at Deep Space Nine. Their first encounter was extremely strained, but Sisko eventually forgave him. Picard also recognized Sisko's abilities and refused to forward his resignation, believing he was the right person to command Deep Space Nine. Essentially, the Borg assimilation intended to turn Jean-Luc into the perfect instrument of their will, but he defied all odds and became one of Starfleet's greatest defenders. It sounds like a story with a happy ending, but that was far from the truth. Picard was weaponized, forced to participate in the destruction of his people, and then saved. But the psychological implications never left him. And personally, I feel this was a very nuanced and mature take, because memories don't exist in binary form. The bad ones don't just vanish after the villains have been defeated. Hey, don't get me wrong, this isn't Pop Psychology 101, but it is a fact that trauma and grief linger for much longer than we think they do, and have consequences beyond our understanding. Most science fiction and/or superhero stories conveniently neglect this aspect after the bad dudes are defeated, but Star Trek did not shy away from showing what PTSD can look like, even in traditionally strong and composed people. The unfortunate truth is, in such cases, a happy ending is never in the cards.
There are moments in time.
The death of his family. Yvette's unfortunate passing left a wound in Jean-Luc's heart that never healed. After his encounter with the Borg, which I've just discussed, he was sent to his childhood home in La Barre to recover. He reunited with his brother Robert, but the older man was not very receptive. He felt that his younger brother was still extremely arrogant, and while Jean-Luc was offered a chance to leave Starfleet, Robert taunted him by saying that he had become too unsure of himself. This led to an argument, and eventually a full-blown brawl between the brothers, which ended with both of them laughing and covered in mud. They shared a moment of honesty, with Jean-Luc revealing how guilty he felt about having been kidnapped by the Borg and causing numerous deaths as a result. Robert also disclosed his guilt for having been so envious all his life, and said that his brother was not the one at fault. Even though Robert claimed that he still viewed Jean-Luc in a negative light, they happily shared a drink and talked about how much they would have been punished by their father for having wrestled in the mud. When Picard finally returned to Starfleet, Robert handed him a bottle of the home vintage and asked him not to drink it alone. Robert's son René was later seen sitting outside at night and gazing at the stars, as he dreamed of joining his uncle in space someday. Robert allowed him to continue dreaming. In 2371, both Robert and René tragically passed away in a fire, leaving only Robert's wife Marie behind. In Star Trek Generations, Picard is devastated upon hearing the news, and while he mourns his brother and nephew, he also comes face to face with the fact that he is the last surviving member of his family. I know that he spent most of his life away from Earth, but it is a big consolation for people to know that they do have family out there, somewhere. The pain of his mother's death was always going to be a fresh wound, so coupled with the deaths of his brother and nephew, Jean-Luc became more of a recluse and closed himself off to emotional connections. In Generations, as he went through the Picard family album that he kept aboard the USS Enterprise, he was plagued by guilt for not having made a family of his own, and as he had reached quite an advanced age already, the chances of rectifying that were slim to none. For a man who grew up listening to stories about the greatness of some of his ancestors, this was naturally a hard-hitting blow. I even imagine he had felt that if he had stayed on Earth and tended to his family's vineyard, it would have prevented this fate. Then again, we've already seen how he chose to take risks and walk the path less traveled instead of choosing the safe way out when Q had given him that option. Naturally, the road to greatness, at least for Picard, was paved with grief.
I never said there was a prospect.
At least listen to them, Jean-Luc.
Long-term trauma and PTSD. In Star Trek The Next Generation, episodes like Family show Picard struggling with traumatic memories and guilt over what he was forced to do as Locutus, breaking down and admitting feelings of powerlessness at the things he did under the control of the Borg. In Star Trek First Contact, we have seen Picard awakening from nightmares tied directly to his assimilation. So it's obvious that memories of the Borg still invade his mind years later. And these are not just casual flashbacks. They are chilling memories that his mind and body remember and inform his decisions as a leader. By the time of Star Trek Picard, the trauma has become part of his everyday life. Even decades after the events of The Best of Both Worlds, we see how Picard continues to grapple with his anguish as he returns to a Borg cube again in the impossible box, where memories grip him like a vice and the emotional weight of his past threatens to undo his very existence. He himself says that his last trip to a cube was not voluntary, a painful reminder that the ordeal has stayed with him after all this time. I believe that one reason for these persistent PTSD-like symptoms is that in Borg memory, he is still Locutus. Even those Borg who never met him personally continue to recognize him by that name, and references to Locutus echo through the shared hive mind and beyond. Jean-Luc has not been able to outrun his trauma, because it's almost been permanently etched there. And even this is not one-sided, because just as the Borg know him as Locutus, he himself remains connected to them against his wishes. So that name and memory is one he can never truly leave behind. 30 years following his assimilation, Picard told 7 of 9 that he felt like part of his humanity had been lost forever since he was liberated from the collective. This proves that deep down, he no longer sees himself as a true human or a true Borg, but something between the two.
They removed portions of his parietal lobe.
Why the hell would they want that?
The genetic curse, Borg DNA passed on. As I mentioned earlier, for the longest time, Picard was grieved by the fact that he was the last surviving member of his family. At that time, he was unaware that he had fathered a son named Jack with Beverly Crusher. After being told this, the man saved Jack in 2401 when he was tracked by Vadic. Later, Jack was trapped on the USS Titan A, and the changelings were interested in the dormant Borg component of his DNA. This ties directly to his father's assimilation, which fundamentally altered Picard's genetics, and, unknown to anyone at that time, he passed it to his son. This is revealed in the episode Vox, and it's only then that Beverly Crusher realizes that Picard never had Irumodic syndrome to begin with. A lot of revelations happen all at once, so naturally, Jack feels conflicted enough to follow the voice in his head instead of heeding the advice of his parents. He refuses to go to Kesselavar and have the Vulcans lobotomize the Borg out of him, and forcibly departs in a shuttlecraft. At that point, Picard remarks how Jack inherited the best of Beverly, but the worst of his father. Beverly, too, regrets how she lost her other son Wesley to space, and therefore was so protective of Jack that she was too blind to see the reality that was right before her. While we know that the ending of Star Trek Picard set up Jack Crusher to get a possible sequel of his own, that post-credit scene with Q, anyone? The truth is that he also carries part of Jean-Luc's pain due to the Borg component of his DNA. I think it was quite a bittersweet moment for Picard to realize that he had a son, so he's not the last Picard, but he unknowingly passed Borg DNA to his son, which is likely to cause the boy as much pain as it had caused him. What do you guys think? Did he feel relief or regret?
Locutus.
Your son appears to send instructions.
After everything, did Jean-Luc finally get his happy ending? Star Trek Picard's final season brings Picard's trauma to a full circle. His final confrontation with the Borg was not as Locutus or a Starfleet officer who was previously their captive. He chose to do it as a father, and his primary intention was not vindication, but just love for his son. The very basis of his assimilation was the fact that it happened without his consent. He unfortunately had no control over what he was forced to do while under their control, but in the 3rd season of this show, he symbolically finds redemption for the events at Wolf 359. He enters the Borg cube to save Jack, but this time he is not a weapon, and he is not a convenient tool created by the collective to further their ambitions. He is simply a father who has experienced what real haunting can feel like and does not want that for his son. Picard knew that he could not rescue Jack without plugging himself back into the collective and possibly losing himself and becoming Locutus once more. He confessed that both he and Jack were the same, as they both wanted connection all their lives, and Jean-Luc had repressed that need for a long time, finally coming to understand that he needed his son and could not remain an aloof man any longer. His rescuing Jack from his destiny as the Vox of Borg was what saved the galaxy and himself. Both men realized that they needed each other. This heartwarming confession was the very thing that broke the Borg Queen's spell and gave Jack closure, because the first time he had sought out his father, he had been disappointed to hear Admiral Picard say that Starfleet was the only family he needed. He may have earlier claimed to Laris that he was not a man who required a legacy, but Picard learned the hard way that Jack is his legacy and the son he always wanted. When Jack reverted to his true self, the Enterprise destroyed the Borg cube and their queen for good, ending the threat on the United Federation of Planets that began in the Best of Both Worlds and Star Trek First Contact. Featuring the Next Generation's Enterprise D in the final episodes of Star Trek Picard was a fitting ingredient that brought together the TNG reunion. The scene where the crew of Enterprise D gathered for another game of poker was almost emotional, not just because it mirrored the ending of TNG. I'm sure that to all fans, it signified that Picard was finally openly acknowledging these people as his chosen family after having kept his guard down for so long around them. This scene, plus the one where he and Beverly Crusher accompany Jack to the latter's new starship post, is where Jean-Luc's story ties up all the loose ends. Some people expected the ending to have more fanfare, but I thought it was perfect because the show was about a man who was never interested in grandeur. The quiet, satisfying ending where he finally was able to make peace with his demons and connect with his loved ones is the biggest triumph in Jean-Luc Picard's legendary life. His trials are done, as echoed by Q when he comes back for Jack Crusher and pretty much passes the baton to the next generation, paving the way for Star Trek legacy. Picard's compassion, restraint, moral clarity, and sense of responsibility are not traits that exist despite his suffering, because they are direct consequences of the same. He values individuality because he was stripped of his own, and understands loss because he has lived through it. His childhood scars, losing his own beating heart, and being turned into a weapon by the Borg did not weaken him, nor did they act as cheap plot devices. He is a great captain, not because of his pain, but in spite of it.